Thank you, Christine, and thank you to everyone who's made time in their busy diaries to be here today. This is a Team Scotland event, so we've got hundreds of colleagues literally from across Transport Scotland, ScotRail and Network Rail Scotland signed up for the latest in a series of Team Scotland events. The first one was around net zero and sustainability and our plans to decarbonise, which obviously are extremely important, extremely high profile. And of course, here in Scotland, we are looking forward to hosting COP26, the UN's climate change conference in November of this year. And the second of our events, today's events, is really about how the finances of the railway are constructed. We've talked a lot about the need to be more efficient. We've talked about the need to grow revenue, and we felt it was important that we spent some time making sure that everyone understood how it all works, and secondly, and most importantly, what you can do in your role, I should say, to help our post-coronavirus recovery. As we know, coronavirus has changed absolutely everything in our lives, both at home and at work. Some of those changes are permanent, and if we are going to thrive and survive as a rail industry, we need to adapt. That's what successful businesses do. So I hope you have a great afternoon and you learn lots and you have lots of questions, and hopefully we will do our best to answer them. So I've got a few slides I'll take you through before I hand over to Bill, who will give us the government's perspective. But first of all, just some basic facts around the finances of GB Rail, so you can understand how what we're doing here in Scotland fits in, and you get a sense of how Scotland compares to the rest of the GB network. So next slide, please, as we're so used to hearing. So this is how expenditure on the railway is spent in Great Britain, and total rail industry expenditure across GB Rail is broadly about £20 billion per annum. And to put that into context, the total income from the fare box, which is collected by all the operators across GB, is about £10 billion per annum. So as you can see, our industry requires huge sums of public money, and the reasons why the governments subsidise it is because, of course, we generate economic benefits which aren't captured in the fare box. And if we break the expenditure down across the different aspects of our great industry, albeit relatively fragmented, about 10 billion or so is spent by the TOCs, the franchised passenger operators, whether they are Department for Transport TOCs or Transport Scotland TOCs like ScotRail and Caledonian Sleeper. So the total expenditure there is in the region of about 10 billion. So compare that with an income of about 10 billion. What you will see is at an operating level, the franchised operators essentially just about cover their costs. And you can see in the franchised operators column there a breakdown of the 10 billion, and the biggest cost there, 3.6 billion, of course, being our people. Moving across to the Network Rail column, that's the middle one, where the annual expenditure across GB is in the region of 9 billion, 8 billion if you take income out. And there you can see where the big numbers are. 2.9 billion on renewing the network, 2.1 billion on operating the infrastructure management. And then over on the right hand side, this is the other column, and you can see there how the railways spend their money on freight, on High Speed 1, on non-franchised operators, for example. So the big picture message there is £20 billion worth of spend, £10 billion worth of income. This industry is highly reliant on government support because railways are brilliant at creating benefits for society which are not captured in the fare box. Next slide, please. This analysis essentially takes those numbers and we have a look at what happens when you break it down across different regions and nations across the UK. And these statistics are taken from the Office of Rail and Road statistics, which they publish relatively frequently. And what this shows is the income of the rail industry broken down by Network Rail region and nation. And these cover the period pre-coronavirus. So this is what it looks like in normal times. So Scotland is the middle bar, Wales is the bar over to the right, and then we've got Eastern, Northwestern, Central and Southern. And some key things here is the light blue wedge is the government support wedge, and here in Scotland that's 20.5p pence, 20.5 pence per passenger kilometre, I should say. So you can see that we have the greatest reliance on government income here in Scotland. We have a relatively high level of income if you add both the income we get from government and from the fare box together. And a lot of that is due to the fact that fares, for example, are on average about 20% lower in Scotland than across GB. So all other things being equal, you would expect lower fare income and therefore a higher contribution by government. Next slide, please. And then on expenditure, again, this looks at a rail industry expenditure broken down by the Network Rail regions and nations, and also by Network Rail and franchised train operating companies, principally ScotRail, of course, here in Scotland. And what this shows is a high level of expenditure on the railway in Scotland, which might explain why we've got such a brilliant railway in Scotland. And about half of that expenditure is spent primarily on ScotRail, and about half of that on Network Rail here in Scotland. So it's a relatively high expenditure, high income railway, but a lot of that income provided by government. Next slide, please. So as you know, we're building the best railway Scotland's ever had, and we're not very far away from that at all. I spent all day on Friday riding around the network, and I had a fantastic day, and the product is looking absolutely brilliant, but of course we want to make it even better. But we also need to decarbonise it, and that isn't cheap. And there's been quite a lot of people asking questions, well, you know, with coronavirus, can we afford to decarbonise the railway here in Scotland? And of course, the answer to that question is we have to decarbonise the railway in Scotland. Net zero is law in Scotland by 2045, in the UK 2050. And as well as that, there's the additional commitment to decarbonise the passenger railway here in Scotland by 2035. So these are mandatory, it's legally binding. The Scottish Government will have to report to Parliament on an annual basis with how it is getting on with meeting its own legislative requirements for net zero. So we're going to have to be able to afford net zero. We can't put net zero on the back burner just because our customers have disappeared, which is one reason why we need to get much more efficient on things like electrification, for example, because they're going to be absolutely critical to achieving net zero for 2035. And actually, in some cases, coronavirus will have helped us achieve the cost of net zero, because the projects we were working on pre-pandemic, which were about expanding peak capacity, creating more platforms and more track capacity, which tend to be extraordinarily expensive, and around accommodating the morning and evening peak demands, which are by nature quite inefficient to cater for. Well, they've gone, and no one's expecting them to come back. So actually, coronavirus and the end of sort of Monday to Friday 9 till 5 commuting, whilst it gives us an income challenge, actually on the project side, it gives us a slight opportunity, because we can pause or delay or cancel those capacity enhancing projects, so we can focus on the decarbonising projects. Next slide, please. But of course, you saw in the previous graph how reliant the rail industry is on income through the fare box. £10 billion across GB, in the region of about 375 million per annum in ScotRail, and we know that revenue collapsed round about lockdown 1, and it's recovered. It's ebbed and flowed as lockdown has tightened and eased, but we're still at about 30% of pre-pandemic demand, so we have a major problem on our hands. And Scottish Government and UK Government acted swiftly and decisively to help the train operators like ScotRail with this massive problem, by essentially entering into emergency management arrangements, which transferred the costs and the revenue of all the train operating companies back to the taxpayer. And that lack of revenue, which was a result of the lockdown restrictions, has been compensated on a pound for pound basis, essentially. So the £375 million that ScotRail used to earn in annual fare box income, that clearly collapsed overnight, and that loss of revenue was subsidised by the taxpayer. And that's why we've been able to keep services running, keep everyone in their jobs, protect terms and conditions, and not furlough anybody, which I think puts us in a very fortunate position compared to other industries. And I don't think we should forget the fact that the government have stepped in to support us during this time of national crisis. And so if you take from April to June last year, the GB government funded the TOCs across the UK by about £2 billion. That was more in 3 months than the normal subsidy for a whole annual year. The numbers were absolutely huge. Rail spending increased during coronavirus more than health spending did, for example. And that's because we're a public service with a revenue line, which makes us a little bit interesting, but it does mean that we're quite easy to see when you look at the accounts of UK and Scottish Government right now, and why we must act fast to get the cost of the railway back to pre-pandemic levels as fast as we possibly can. Next slide, please. So what do we need to do? Well, clearly, UK government and Scottish government have been shoveling in hundreds of millions, billions of pounds into our great industry. They've made sure that we could keep services running, protect employment, not furlough anybody. And now it's our time to repay that generosity to the Scottish Government and the Scottish taxpayer. We absolutely must reduce the unit cost of delivery. We must deliver more for less, both through the franchise and through Network Rail. Obviously, in ScotRail, costs are competed every 7 years or so through the franchise agreement. in Network Rail, we essentially have a negotiation with the rail regulator, and efficiencies are baked into our plan. But even when the rail industry delivers on time and on budget, which I'm pleased to say we have a good track record of here in Scotland, we are regarded as being reassuringly expensive to our clients and funders. So if we take Scotland, it's actually the railway which absorbs most of the transport funding by Scottish Government, and yet we're only carrying a fraction of the journeys, even in pre-pandemic times. And so if we're going to retain our sort of license to operate and convince taxpayers and politicians that we're still a good investment, we have to reduce the unit cost of delivery. And that doesn't mean cutting costs and harming revenue. It means genuine efficiency, homegrown efficiency, to make ourselves more competitive and efficient. And of course, we've got to grow the revenue as well, both from passengers and from freight. I don't think anyone is expecting pre-pandemic levels of revenue to come back fast. I think most industry forecasters would say they're expecting 80% of revenue to come back over a 3 to 5 year period. So that leaves us a big hole, and that's why we need to fill that hole with efficiency. And of course, the revenue is not going to come back in the same way that it was before. I think we have seen the death of Monday to Friday, 9 till 5 commuting. I think leisure will bounce back quicker. We've seen that already here in Scotland. A week last Saturday, ScotRail had 50% of its normal pre-pandemic revenue, and yet during the week we're way below that. So who would have guessed people would have preferred to go to the pubs and the shops than go back to the office? But it's true. And what that means is the way that we operate and maintain and renew our network has got to change with the new markets that we're seeing. So if customers want to travel more at weekend than they do during the week, then we've got to look at when we maintain and renew the network and close the railway. We might need to move that into the week when people might spend more time working from home or on Microsoft Teams, for example. And the other thing is, we're not currently expecting to put our pre-pandemic timetable back at all, because only 1 in 2 of all the seats we were operating was occupied, a load factor of 50%, which doesn't strike me as being a great use of taxpayers' money. So we think we can put back a better timetable next year by operating fewer services, which will be more efficient, and it will also create more space on the network for freight. And I think most people would expect post-pandemic a smaller passenger revenue, a smaller passenger railway, and ergo a larger freight railway, because there'll be more space to path them onto the network. So there is a huge amount of re-engineering here to be done. We're going to have to be agile and flexible and up for change. The clever people in ScotRail Commercial will grow revenue as fast as they possibly can. We need to think really long and hard about when we close the network to undertake essential engineering work. But the number one thing that everybody on this call can do is to be cost conscious, to be as efficient as we possibly can, and to reduce the unit cost of delivering our railway. So I think that's the end of my slides, Oscar. And I'm going to hand over now to Bill Reeve, who's the Director of Rail at Transport Scotland, who's going to give us the perspective from the Scottish Government end of the telescope. Thank you.